We're now going to look at Arraylist. Let's say we have our 5 objects and they are in an array list. Now, Arraylist gives us a lot of new abilities on top of the abilities we had from the iterable interface, the collection interface, and the list interface. The Arraylist class has all those abilities as well as some new abilities. But what is an Arraylist? Let's start from there. An Arraylist is a resizable array implementation of the list interface. What does that mean? Remember that we saw arrays at the beginning of the course. An Arraylist acts almost like an array. However, remember that an array had fixed length, which means that once you created an array, you were not able to reduce its size or increase its size. But an Arraylist is resizable, and Arraylist implements list. And we looked at the list interface in the last video. Now, one of the things that we did not discuss in the previous videos is that a lot of those interfaces that we looked at, the collection interface and the list interface, had a few methods, and we discussed those methods. There were a lot of other methods as well, and some of those methods that we did not discuss are optional methods, which means that a class that implements that interface does not necessarily need to provide the implementation code for those optional methods. But what Arraylist does is that it implements all the optional list operations. So all the optional methods the list interface had, Arraylist implements all of them. So the list interface had some optional methods, and all of them are not here. Only a few examples are. So the list interface had add as an optional method. Clear, remove, and set were also optional methods in the list interface. What Arraylist does is that it implements all of those list operations that were optional. And we're going to look at them in a little bit more detail in this video. Arraylist permits null, so you can have objects that are basically null values, and they can be stored in an Arraylist. Also remember that since Arraylist is implementing list interface, Arraylist also allows duplicates, so you can have duplicate elements in an Arraylist. And Arraylist also allows us to have methods to manipulate the size of the array. So the size of the array is not fixed. You can add elements to the array, and the size of the Arraylist will increase dynamically at that point. And when you remove elements, the size of the Arraylist decreases automatically. There are a total of 3 constructors that Arraylist has, and we will look at the 2 basic ones. So out of the 3 total constructors, these are the 2 constructors that you will mostly be using. If you use just this constructor that does not have any input parameters, then an Arraylist is created with an initial capacity of 10. Which means that when the Arraylist is created, enough space for 10 elements is allocated for the Arraylist. But you can also construct an Arraylist with a specified capacity. So if you use this constructor where we have one parameter, this parameter is basically used to create an Arraylist of a specific capacity. So if you create a new Arraylist and say Arraylist 6, then an Arraylist will be created with an initial capacity of 6. Let's now look at some of the methods that Arraylist provides. The first method that we're going to talk about is add. So this method allows us to add new elements to the Arraylist. There are a few variations of this method, and we are going to look at 2 of them. The first variation is when you have 2 input parameters. The first one is the index, and the second one is the element. E here signifies any type of object. So we could say add to string and then a value of a string. Or we could say add 3 and 4. So at that point, the integer 4 would be added to the Arraylist at index 3. So this method inserts an element at a specified index. We could also have another variation of the add method. And here, the add method only has one input parameter. And what would happen here is that it would add this element to the end of the list. We have a clear method, which removes all the elements from the list. We also have a remove method. And again, we have a few variations of the remove method. The first variation is when we specify the index. If we use this method with a specific index, then this method would remove the element at that specified index. So for example, here object 1 has an index of 0, object 2 has an index of 1, object 3 has an index of 2, object 4 has an index of 3, and object 5 has an index of 4. So if we say remove 3, then 0, 1, 2, 3, this object will be removed from the list. And lastly, we also have a method called set. What the set method does is that it takes two input parameters and it replaces the element at this index with this element. So let's say right now, if we use this method set and say set 3 object 6, then at index 3, object 4 will be replaced by object 6. So object 4 will be thrown out and object 6 will be placed in place of object 4. That's what the set method does. Arraylist has a lot of other methods as well, and they are variations of these or some other ways to manipulate the objects in the array list. But these are the main ones, in addition to the ones that we already saw in the collection interface and the list interface, as well as the iterable interface. So if you start to think from the very beginning, what did we have? We started from the iterable interface. The iterable interface allowed us to use an enhanced for loop on a collection of objects, and it could be any collection of objects. It also allowed us to create an iterator over that collection. The iterator had the hasNext and the next methods. So this gave us basic abilities such as navigating between the elements of a group of objects. So what the iterable interface actually did is give us the ability to move around our collection of objects. We could move from one object to the other, and we could do some operations on each object. So that's what the iterable interface allowed us to do. The collection interface allowed us to do some more specific tasks. For example, we could check if a collection contains a certain object, whether or not this collection is equal to another collection, whether or not the collection is empty, what's the size of the collection, and stuff like that. So the collection interface allowed us to have some more specific advanced abilities. So now we can move around our group from one object to the other because of the iterable interface, and we can also see whether or not our collection of objects contains a specific element, was the size of that whole collection, whether or not the collection is empty, and all of that came because the collection interface allowed us to do that. Now from there, we created the list interface. The list interface had some more methods. Now the list interface could do some more advanced things. For example, it could get a certain element from the collection. It could tell us what's the index of a certain element. It could also give us a small sublist of the elements that we had in a list. And after that, we created the Arraylist class. And the Arraylist class has all these abilities. It can move around the different objects. It can see whether or not there is a certain object within the collection, whether or not the collection is empty, what's the size of the collection. It can also get a specific element. It could find the index of a specific element, and it could do a lot of other things based on what iterable collection and list interfaces allowed us to do. On top of all of that, it also now created its own method of adding an element to the array list. It could clear all the elements. It could remove a particular element. Also, it could replace a particular element, and Arraylist has control over exactly what position these elements are placed or removed from. And that ultimately creates our Arraylist class. So now I hope you understand what Arraylist is and how Arraylist can be used to manipulate a group of objects together.